South Carolina. 1838. The kind of year people like to sand down until it's smooth enough to teach to children. The kind of place people like to package as moss and verandas and slow, romantic air. But I'm going to start where they always panic. The ground. Not the speeches. Not the portraits. The ground. Because the ground remembers even when the record pretends it doesn't. In the spring of our own century, modern asphalt, modern budgets, modern meetings, a crew cut into a strip of earth behind a property line that has changed hands so many times it has almost become innocent by paperwork. A drainage improvement. A utility trench. Nothing poetic. Then the blade hit something that didn't feel like root or stone. It gave that dead, blunt resistance that makes everyone stop talking at once. The foreman leaned in. Somebody said, "Don't touch it." Somebody else said, "Just cover it." But the soil had already opened, and what it offered back was not one body, not two, but a pattern. A density that doesn't happen by accident. Close-set burials. No marker stones. No iron nameplates. No family plot geometry. The kind of burials that only make sense if the people buried there were never supposed to be mourned in public. Within minutes, there was a call. Within an hour, there was another call. And then the familiar liturgy arrived. The one institutions recite when they want a problem to become invisible again. Stop work. Clear the area. No photographs. No personal notes. All communication through one channel. And above all, do not create a second record while we are deciding how to manage the first. The irony is almost insulting. The people in that ground were erased once in life. And then, when they surfaced, they were threatened with erasure again, this time in the name of process, liability, sensitivity. Whatever polite word you prefer when the truth is inconvenient. I'm not telling you this to romanticize a work site. I'm telling you because this is how the cover-up breathes in the modern world. Not always with a shovel in the night, but with a meeting invite and a directive that quietly forbids memory. And I'm telling you because the paper trail that matters doesn't begin in our century. It begins in ink. It begins in 1838. The year that sits like a rusted nail in the middle of this story. Because in the material that survived, what I have in front of me, what someone saved when saving it could only cause trouble, there is a planter's ledger with a line that refuses to behave like ordinary bookkeeping. It isn't poetic. It isn't emotional. That's why it's terrifying. A date. A charge. And the phrase that should make your stomach tighten if you understand how records work. Burials paid in cash. That night. Not burial. Burials. Plural. Paid in cash. No names attached. No individual count recorded with care. No who. No where. No pastor noted. No carpentry account that would suggest coffins for a family. Just money moved quickly, cleanly, the way you move money when you don't want it traced through the usual channels. And once you see that line, the modern silence makes sense. Because it's not a new instinct. It's an inherited procedure. Silence as policy, carried forward like an heirloom. Here is what you're going to learn if you stay with me. What the record actually contained, what it deliberately refused to contain, and why the same decision, to hide, to reseal, to rebury, keeps repeating across generations like a confession that can't stop being rewritten. If you're listening from somewhere far from South Carolina, I want you to comment where you're from. Not for engagement, for accountability, for a map of witnesses, Because the only thing stronger than institutional forgetting is public remembering, done on purpose. Now let me tell you the official story. The one that wants you calm. In the official version, slavery is a chapter with a beginning and an end, a monstrous thing that somehow happened without leaving a monstrous paper trail. In the official version, plantations have cemeteries, sure, but time is blamed for the missing names, weather, neglect, the passage of years. In the official version, a burial ground without markers is presented like a natural tragedy, as if nobody decided anything, as if erasure is simply what happens when people don't have the resources to preserve memory. That's the story designed to protect everyone still alive. It's convenient. It's non-specific. It requires no culprit except time. But that's not what the receipts show. The receipts don't show a lack of capability. They show choices. Repeatable choices. The kind of choices you see when you put the record under a harsh light and refuse to let it charm you. The first thing you learn in this kind of investigation is that history isn't silent. It's edited. And the second thing you learn is that the editing has a style. It has habits. It has a signature. Here's the thesis you need to hold on to right now. The omissions in 1838 were not accidents. They were decisions made by people who understood exactly what documentation does. Names are power. Names create obligations. Names invite questions. Names are the first step toward a person being treated like a person even after death. So when you find a cluster of graves without names, and then you find a ledger that records burial as a cash transaction without names, you're not looking at forgetfulness. You're looking at a mechanism. And mechanisms don't run once. They run until somebody breaks them. To understand how this works, you have to accept that there are two archives. The first is the official archive. Ledgers, inventories, deeds, correspondence, church records, the clean stacks of paper that make an institution feel legitimate. The official archive is where the powerful leave their fingerprints proudly. It is also where they learn to wash those fingerprints off. The second is the human archive. Oral histories carried in families, warnings passed down about certain patches of land, names whispered because they were never allowed to be carved, the stubborn memory of descendants who grew up hearing, "Don't dig there," without being told why. The human archive doesn't always have dates. The official archive does. And that is why the official archive becomes a weapon when it decides not to name. Because the absence of a name inside a dated document is not neutral. It is a moral act. It is the choice to keep a person uncounted. This is where I draw the line, and I'm going to draw it early. When a society can record the weight of cotton bales, the price of rice, the purchase of nails, the cost of a horse, the brand of whiskey, and then fails to record the names of the people it worked to death, this is not a clerical mistake. This is an accounting philosophy. It tells you exactly who the record exists for. And it tells you exactly who it is designed to erase. In 1838, in South Carolina, the plantation world was a bureaucracy as much as it was a brutality. It ran on lists. It ran on tallies. It ran on hands counted like tools. Which means the disappearance of names is not random. It is a chosen silence. So when I say burials paid in cash, I'm not asking you to gasp at a spooky line in an old book. I'm asking you to hear what it implies. A death event significant enough to require multiple burials, urgent enough to pay immediately, and sensitive enough to avoid the ordinary record routes that would attach accountability. Cash is fast. Cash is untraceable. Cash is what you use when you want the transaction to end at the moment it happens. And when the dead are enslaved, the temptation to end the story right there, to bury and move on and let the ground do the rest, isn't just cruelty. It's strategy. It's reputational management. It's the belief that if you don't write a name down, you don't owe anyone an explanation. But here's the part that makes this more than a local horror from 1838. The same logic is still alive. The modern shutdown. The no photographs. The quick recovering of soil. The controlled language. The quiet pressure to let it all return to normal. It's the same decision, wearing modern clothes. And that continuity is the real indictment. Because it means the past isn't past. It's procedural. It's filed. It's archived. It's enforced. In the next stretch of this story, I'm going to take the official narrative apart in front of you and lay the human narrative beside it, piece by piece, until the shape of the mechanism becomes visible. Not because I enjoy darkness, because responsibility demands sight, because the dead without names cannot argue their case, and because if we don't insist on naming what was done, precisely, with dates and paper and receipts, then the policy of silence wins again. You can't understand the grave without understanding the project that fed it. And in South Carolina in the late 1830s, projects didn't begin with a shovel. They began with paper, orders, budgets, schedules, and the small, clean phrases that let men do unclean things while pretending they are only managing logistics. By 1838, the plantation economy in the Low Country was not just brute force, it was administration. Rice fields and dikes and canals were engineering problems, and engineering problems attract a particular kind of language. Efficiency, improvement, output, delay, loss. When you hear those words in a record, don't let them lull you. In this story, those words are the door. They are the place where a human being gets converted into a unit. 1838 is not a random year. It sits inside a decade when South Carolina's political class was obsessing over control of labor, control of movement, control of rumor. The system had already learned that brutality without coordination is messy. Mess creates witnesses. Witnesses create risk. So the brutality became organized. You see it in how work is planned. Not as a series of days, but as a season with deadlines. Spring preparation, summer push, late summer sickly season, fall recovery. It's an annual machine. And what matters for our purposes is that machines have incentives. In 1838, the incentive was simple. Maximize production and complete capital improvements, dikes, trunk gates, drainage, causeways, without attracting attention to the cost in bodies. The most important constraint wasn't morality. It was optics. The planner class did not fear God. It feared scandal, creditor pressure, and the kind of talk that makes an overseer unemployable and a household name poisonous. So what starts the project? It is always framed as necessity. An embankment failing. A canal silting. A new field being opened. A contract that requires delivery. A public road or wharf that must be completed. And in a world where enslaved people are the workforce by default, procurement doesn't mean hiring free labor. It means distributing coercion more aggressively. The elegant solution leadership proposes is never written as murder. It's written as acceleration. Extend hours. Reassign hands. Increase discipline. Reduce idleness. And because the official archive is obsessed with order, the paper trail appears early. A note authorizing a purchase, a directive to the overseer, an instruction to the driver. The record pretends it is about materials, boards, nails, lime, iron, rope, but that's camouflage. Those purchases are the shadows cast by a decision to push human bodies past the limits they can survive. Here's what to watch for in the receipts when a project begins. The budget lines that appear ordinary until you line them up with the calendar. In early 1838, the improvement season begins. Tools in quantity, repairs in bulk, supplies that suggest longer workdays. In the same window you see medicine purchased, not for comfort, but for maintenance. Whiskey and camphor and quinine-like substitutes show up not as care, but as fuel to keep labor moving. And then, quietly, you see the institutional obsession with time. Penalty for delay? Urgency in correspondence. The kind of pressure that turns any supervisor into a butcher with a schedule. The record will rarely say, "Work them until they drop." It will say, "We cannot afford stoppage." It will say, "Losses must be contained." It will say, "Replace those unfit." And that is why the procurement matters. Procurement is where violence becomes anonymous. A man can deny cruelty, but an invoice cannot deny intent. If you buy extra spades and extra lime and extra boards during the same week, your labor roster changes shape. You are not preparing for an ordinary season. You are preparing for disposal. And in 1838, disposal is not a metaphor. Disposal is a practice. Now, the workforce. This is where the language of erasure stops being a theme and becomes a technique. In the privileged world, people have full names and dates and kinship. In the plantation record, the enslaved are written as first names, roles, ages, categories, boy, woman, prime, old, sick. When a person is reduced to a category, they become easy to replace. Replaceability is the psychological lubricant that makes mass death administratively tolerable. And the archive reflects it. Where the planter's family has biographies, the enslaved have tallies. Where a white child's fever gets a worried letter, a black adult's fever becomes a note about reduced output. The record is not merely incomplete. It is structured to create two different kinds of humanity on paper. So I'm going to do what the record tries to prevent. I'm going to pull a few people out of the categories and force you to look at them as individuals. Micro-portraits. Not sentimental. Specific. Because this is the moral obligation. If the system erased them, we have to reconstruct them. In 1838, on a plantation ledger, you might see a woman listed as Hagar with no surname, no family line, no birthplace. 1 month she's accounted for in rations. The next month she's absent, and the line doesn't say dead. It says nothing. The ledger simply continues as if absence is a natural condition. Another name, Cuffy. Written under ditchers or field. Then, later, another Cuffy appears. Same name, different age marker. The kind of substitution that tells you the record is not tracking a person. It is tracking a slot. And then there's the child. The record almost never cares about children as people. It cares about them as future labor. A little Rose shows up under cloth distribution, too small to work fully, old enough to carry water, old enough to be punished. Then she disappears into the blank space that children fall into when nobody thinks they will be questioned. Do you hear what I'm saying? These are not ghosts. These are bureaucratic vanishings. The record doesn't need to lie loudly. It just needs to stop speaking at the exact moment a human life ends. That's the trick. That's the policy. Now, compare the recording of privileged versus disposable workers, and you see the whole moral structure exposed. A planter will note the purchase of a horse with more care than the death of a man. He will note the repair of a roof with more specificity than the burial of a woman. Because property must be protected. But the enslaved, classified as property in law, are treated in the record as a lower class of property. Consumable. Replaceable. A broken tool is repaired. A broken person is replaced. That is not me dramatizing. That is the logic embedded in the paper. And this is where the project and the workforce collide. A big job begins: dike work, drainage, expansion. The record shows the mobilization. More hands assigned, more discipline noted, perhaps an overseer boasting about order. And then the first hint of something else. Sudden gaps. The roster holds steady on paper even as names change. The total number of hands remains respectable. That stability is not reassurance. It's concealment. If you can keep the numbers stable, you can keep the outside world calm. Creditors don't panic. Neighbors don't gossip. Family members don't ask whether excessive severity has occurred. Stability is the mask. So when you see a ledger in 1838 that can casually write burials paid in cash, understand the precondition. A workforce whose individuality has already been stripped away on paper. You can only bury people without names if you have first trained the record to treat people as nameless. That training takes years. By 1838, it was perfected. And I need you to sit with the fact that this isn't only about cruelty. It's about administration. A system that can plan a project down to nails and lime is a system that can plan erasure. A system that can track output, can track disappearance, then choose not to. That choice is the indictment. Not ignorance. Not the times. Choice. If you want to know why the graves had no names, don't start at the graves. Start at the procurement. Start at the roster. Start at the language that turns a person into a unit. Because once a person becomes a unit, the end of that person becomes a rounding error. And when human beings become rounding errors, the ground fills quietly and the ledger stays clean. In 1838, that is the kind of cleanliness that should disgust us. Not because we are modern and superior, but because the moral test is old. When you have the power to name, you name. When you refuse to name, you are participating in the killing twice, once in the body, and again in the memory. The record is never going to describe the conditions the way a survivor would. It can't. Not because it lacks words, but because it was built to avoid them. So to reconstruct what 1838 felt like on the ground, you don't wait for a confession. You read the administrative language until it betrays itself. You follow the rations, the tool lists, the medical notes, the discipline entries, because every mundane line is a shadow of an experience someone endured without permission to complain. And in South Carolina's Low Country, in 1838, the conditions weren't a background detail. They were the engine. Heat, water, mosquitoes, rot, fatigue, and the constant threat of punishment. A climate that turns labor into attrition. The plantation didn't need to invent horror. It only needed to keep the work moving inside an environment designed to break bodies. Housing first. The record may say quarters, like it's a neutral term. But quarters in 1838 meant crowding and damp. It meant cabins that held too many people for too many seasons, with air that could not stay clean, with bedding that could not stay dry, with sickness that spread the way smoke spreads, silently, everywhere. Food second. Rations appear in lists because food is not given out as care. It's given out as calibration. Enough calories to keep output acceptable, not enough dignity to keep a person whole. Tools third. Broken handles, dull blades, patched gear. You can see it because repairs repeat. The same items mended again and again, which means the work is outpacing the equipment, which means accidents are not accidents. Safety in that system is always framed as waste. If a tool breaks, it costs money. If a person breaks, the ledger tries to make it cost nothing by not naming it. And sickness in 1838 is not a surprise in the Low Country. The sickly season is practically a calendar entry, late summer into early fall when fever blooms. But what matters is how sickness is treated in the paperwork. For the Planter family, illness is a narrative. Symptoms, fear, visitors, remedies, concern. For enslaved workers, illness is a disruption. Unfit, laid up, reduced, sent away. Those are not medical terms. They are production terms. And production terms do something morally dangerous. They imply the primary harm is not suffering, but inefficiency. That's how a human death becomes administratively tolerable. You write absent instead of dead. You write sent for care and never write the follow-up. You write removed as if a person is an object cleared from a walkway. Discipline is the other constant, and it hides in plain sight. A plantation record does not always brag about punishment, but it often hints at it with euphemisms that are almost worse because they pretend to be orderly. Corrected. Confined. Set an example. Restrained. When you see those words near the same dates as sickness spikes and work intensifies, the picture forms. Bodies pushed, bodies punished, bodies failing, bodies replaced. Not melodrama. Workflow. Now, to keep this from becoming abstract, you need an outsider voice. Not because outsiders are moral heroes, often they're complicit, but because outsiders write differently. They sometimes reveal what the internal record refuses to say. In 1838, that voice might be a visiting inspector, a chaplain, a physician called in because the losses are starting to cost money, or a supervisor's diary written with just enough candor to be damning. The outsider doesn't say mass death. The outsider says something like, many laid up, or the quarters are in a poor state, or the men appear greatly reduced, or burials were conducted quietly. Quietly. That word matters. Quietly means without service, without notice, without names spoken in public. Quietly means the institution understood there was something to hide. And then the first major incident arrives, because in a system like this, the first major incident is not an if. It's a when. In 1838, it could be a collapse in a ditch line, mud giving way under exhausted men, water rising fast, someone pinned, someone pulled out too late. It could be contamination, stagnant water, shared cups, a fever spreading. It could be a fire in the quarters, the kind that turns overcrowding into a death sentence. Whatever the incident is, the pattern in the paperwork is predictable. It is minimized, reframed, or moved into an appendix that does not survive. Instead of people died, you see work interrupted. Instead of we lost 14, you see hands reduced. Instead of they were buried, you see expenses incurred. That reframing is not only rhetorical, it is moral laundering. It teaches the reader, especially the reader in power, to treat harm as a temporary inconvenience rather than a permanent theft of life. And it sets up the next stage. Disappearance not as a shock, but as an expected administrative outcome. By late summer, 1838, August into September, if the typical low-country pattern holds, the record begins to behave strangely. This is where I stop using soft language. Strange behavior in a ledger is not an accident when money is on the line. If you see crossed-out names, overwritten lines, totals that remain steady while individuals vanish, you are seeing an institutional mind at work. And this is where the first vanishings begin, not necessarily the first deaths, but the first deliberate substitutions that make deaths easier to hide. Here is the anomaly you're watching for. Payments or allocations that continue as if the person still exists, while the person disappears from every other place they should appear. A ration list that still accounts for the same number of mouths, even though the roster has shifted. A clothing issue line that remains constant while names change. A tool allotment that stays stable while a laborer is marked absent without explanation. It's not just that someone is gone. It's that the system is smoothing over the gap. In 1838, on paper, you might see a name crossed out and replaced with another first name, no note, no explanation, like swapping a broken part. Or you might see a phrase that looks humane but functions as a trapdoor. Sent away for care. Sent where? By whom? Returned when? The record doesn't say. And it doesn't say because it doesn't want you to ask. Sent away for care is a perfect phrase for erasure because it sounds responsible while producing no accountable outcome. It offers the reader the feeling of decency without the burden of proof. Then you find the more sinister version. Burial expenses with no corresponding death entry. This is where the ledger's mask slips. Because death requires paperwork in any orderly society unless the dead are considered unworthy of record. And in 1838, enslaved death often sat in that exact category. Tolerated, expected, and administratively inconvenient to detail. So the record compromises. It records the cost, not the person. It records the transaction, not the life. It is almost a parody of what accounting is supposed to do. Accounting is meant to clarify reality. Here, it is used to erase it. Present 2. 3 examples and the inference tightens. A name disappears after a fever week. A replacement hand appears within days. A roster total stays unchanged during a known high sickness window. A note about quiet burials appears without names. And then the line that should make you understand the danger of your own curiosity. Burials paid in cash. Not because cash is inherently evil, but because cash is chosen when the institution wants the trail to die with the transaction. Pay in cash, and you minimize witnesses. Pay in cash, and you avoid accounts payable that might later be audited. Pay in cash, and you make the burial a private matter, private enough to become nameless. This is the question that creates danger, the one the record tries to prevent by leaving you nothing to hold. Where did they go? Not philosophically. Literally. What ground received them? Who dug? Who counted? Who stood there while the last breath left a body that had already been reduced to a first name in a column? When the ledger substitutes a name, it is not merely updating. It is closing a case without investigation. It is pronouncing a person finished and unworthy of documentation. And this is where the moral lecture becomes unavoidable. A society that can document every plank and every nail and every bushel, but refuses to document the names of the dead, is not suffering from poor record-keeping. It is practicing selective humanity. In 1838, that practice was profitable. In the modern era, its descendant is no photos, no notes, reseal the ground. The techniques evolve. The intent survives. And our responsibility, the burden we inherit, is to refuse the convenience of their silence, to reconstruct what they tried to dissolve. to insist that disappearance on paper is still disappearance in the world, and that unknown is often not a mystery. It is a decision made by someone who expected you not to fight back. The machine doesn't break all at once. It concentrates. It picks a window and does its worst there, because that's what systems do under pressure. They compress the damage into a period they can later describe as unfortunate and unusual. Then they move on. In this story, that window is the crisis summer of 1838. Late July into August, and then the turn into September, when the low country heat turns every stagnant ditch into a fever factory, and the plantation calendar demands speed anyway, because crops don't wait for mercy. This is the period where the record stops even pretending to be stable. The paper starts breathing harder. Letters multiply. Replacement requests spike. Purchases look like panic disguised as routine. And if you read it with the right suspicion, you can see the institution trying to outrun the consequences of its own design. By July 1838, the roster is already showing strain. Names appear, then vanish. Unfit. Laid up. Absent. Not deaths, not burials, just absences. The ledger still wants to look respectable, so the totals remain smooth. But smooth totals are exactly what you get when you substitute humans like parts. That's the first major tell of a crisis. The number stays steady while the identities churn. In any honest workplace, churn at that scale would trigger questions. In an enslaved workplace, churn is the business model. And in late July 1838, the business model begins to devour itself. Then comes the spike that matters. Requests for replacements. Not always written like desperation, sometimes written like irritated management. Send more hands. Need additional men. Short of ditchers. 2 drivers required. The language is always practical, because practicality is how brutality hides. But the timing is everything. You don't ask for replacements in bulk unless you are losing labor in bulk. And you don't lose labor in bulk in a stable system. You lose labor in bulk when the conditions have become lethal or the discipline has become so excessive it is eating the workforce. Sometimes both at once. In 1838, the Low Country doesn't force you to choose. Heat and sickness weaken the body. Punishment finishes it. August 1838 is where the paper trail begins to look like an emergency trying to disguise itself as normal operations. You see unusual purchases. More lime than usual, more spades, more rough boards, more rope. Lime is the detail that should make you stop. Lime is sanitation on paper and concealment in practice. It can be used to reduce odor, to treat waste, to clean after sickness. It also appears in burial contexts. The record won't tell you which purpose it served, because the record is designed to be plausible in both directions. That's how institutional lies work best. They are written so they can always claim innocence later. But if you find lime purchased alongside a spike in burial expenses and a spike in replacement requests, don't insult yourself by calling it coincidence. This is also the time when a witness voice, an outsider, or a semi-outsider like a supervisor with a private diary, tends to surface. They don't write mass death. They write around it. They write, the men are failing. They write, many down with fever. They write, kept them moving. Chillingly, they write nothing at all about the people and only about the project. Must complete the dike. Cannot lose time. Work continues. That absence is also a testimony. When someone can write about weather in detail but not about dying workers, you're watching conscience being trained out of language. And then there's the separate space. Every crisis in a coercive institution produces a restricted area, because the institution needs somewhere to put what it cannot acknowledge. In late August 1838, the paper begins to hint at it. References to the shed, the lower house, quarantine, the pine line, off-site. Words that are normal on their own, but become sinister when they appear alongside disappearances. In a humane world, quarantine is documented carefully. Names, symptoms, outcomes. In this world, quarantine is a curtain. People go behind it and don't come back, and the record calls that sent away for care. Care, as a word, becomes a weapon. It calms the reader. It blocks the next question. Now listen to this carefully. In crisis windows, the institution's language becomes both more active and more vague. More active because things are happening fast. More vague because specificity creates liability. This is when you see the most defensive writing. Shorter entries. Fewer names. More categories. The record is trying to move quickly without leaving fingerprints. And that's why late August 1838 is the moment where the story stops feeling like inference and starts feeling like procedure. Because by the time you reach early September 1838, the ledger is doing something that is not natural. It is recording the costs of death while refusing the identities of the dead. This is where the line "burials paid in cash" belongs, not in a calm season, not in a quiet month, but inside a peak event window when bodies are going missing and the project is still being pushed forward. Cash isn't just a payment method here. It's an instruction. Do not attach names. Do not create a trail. Do not involve anyone who will ask questions later. Pay, bury, continue. That is the rhythm of an institution protecting itself. And here is the prosecutorial point. If burials were ordinary, they would be ordinary on paper. They would have predictable entries. They would be embedded in the normal machinery of bills and records. Paid in cash is a deviation. Deviations mean intent. Deviations mean someone changed the method because the usual method was too visible. And visibility is what the institution fears more than death itself. Now we enter the confrontation letters, because this is the only time the record starts telling the truth. When someone with leverage demands it. In late September 1838, sometimes October, depending on how long the crisis dragged, letters begin to appear from outside the immediate plantation command. These are not abolitionist pamphlets. These are not moral protests. These are business communications. Owners who hired out enslaved labor. Contractors who supplied men for specific work. Families, trustees, insurers, financiers, people whose interest is not dignity, but asset accountability. And the ugly reality is that this is often the only pressure that forces an admission. Compassion does not move the institution. Liability does. A typical demand is blunt. Return them or account for them. If men were hired for a term, where are they? If they are sick, where's the physician's note? If they died, provide dates and causes. Provide proof. The tone is not tender. It's transactional. But it functions like a flashlight. Because the institution cannot simply shrug at someone who can sue, withhold payment, or spread reputational poison among the planter class. So the institution responds quickly. Defensively. Vaguely. And somewhere in that response, a key line slips out, an admission wrapped in administrative restraint. Not a list of names. Not a count. A phrase like, "Some were lost," or "several expired," or "burials were necessary," followed by the detail that tells you exactly what kind of situation this was. Handled privately, paid immediately, No names recorded. Burials paid in cash. That line is not just chilling. It is evidence of a mindset. It tells you the institution understood that burials create records, and records create accountability, and accountability creates scandal. So they bought themselves silence at the moment of burial. And they bought it with cash, because cash keeps the circle small. Cash keeps the number of witnesses low. Cash makes the dead disappear not only into the ground, but into the gaps between official documents. And notice what else happens in these confrontations. The institution's language shifts to protect itself. It frames death as unavoidable. It blames fever, weather, unexpected severity. It implies proper care without proving it. It offers reassurance without receipts. It may even express regret, carefully worded, strategically placed, because regret can be used like a sedative. But regret without names is a performance. Regret without a list is just another kind of erasure. This is the moral hinge of 1838. The only time the system admits loss is when it fears consequences from the living with power. The dead without power get silence. That's the policy. And here is the responsibility I'm going to insist on. We do not accept a system's preferred record as the complete record. We don't let paid in cash be the last word over human bodies. We reconstruct. We name where we can. We count where we must. Because if we don't, then we are participating, quietly, in the same institutional decision that made those graves nameless in the first place. After the confrontation letters, you might expect a reckoning. You might expect a list. You might expect at the very least a grudging form of accounting that acknowledges what happened in 1838, but that expectation is the trap. Institutions like this don't correct themselves when exposed. They refine the method, they learn what almost got them caught, and they build a procedure to prevent the same risk next time. That is what I mean when I say silence is policy. It isn't a mood, it's a workflow. And by the end of 1838, October into November, the workflow is visible if you know where to look. Euphemisms replace nouns, annexes go missing, logbooks cannot be located, burials become private arrangements, and paperwork is reorganized so no single document carries the full story. A disappearance is not achieved by one dramatic act. It is achieved by distributing responsibility into small acts that feel routine to the people doing them. Start with the language. In late 1838, the record stops saying anything that can be pinned down. Died becomes lost. Buried becomes disposed. Sent away for care becomes the default explanation for anyone who vanishes. If a ledger must record something, it records expense without identity. If a letter must respond, it responds with tone rather than detail, swift, defensive, polite, and empty. The institution learns to write like fog. Fog can't be cross-examined. Fog can't be sued. Then come the classified or separate materials, the annexes that everyone references, but no one is allowed to see. This is how bureaucracies hide the worst facts. They don't destroy everything. They relocate it into a category that most people cannot access. In 1838, that might look like a private book kept by the manager, or a medical log held by a physician, or an internal tally that never enters the formal estate papers. The point is not whether a word like classified appears in ink. The point is the behavior. The main record hints at another record, and that other record is absent. That absence is not accidental. It is the design feature. Missing pages are the next mechanism. Not every missing page is a conspiracy, but a pattern of missing pages around the crisis window is not neutral. It is the paper equivalent of a locked door. If late July and August 1838 are the months of peak sickness and peak replacements, and the ledger for those weeks is torn, water damaged, lost, or copied without the relevant leaves, you are not looking at bad preservation. You are looking at selective survival. The archive becomes an accomplice not because it lies, but because it is curated, and then there is the burial handling itself. This is where silence as procedure becomes physical. Burials become restricted not to honor the dead, but to control witnesses. The work is moved to a different edge of the property. a low patch beyond the everyday sightline, a line of trees that serves as a visual boundary. In 1838, the logic of choosing a burial site is not spiritual. It is strategic. Choose ground that will later be developed. Choose ground that will later be plowed. Choose ground that will later be claimed as unused. The institution anticipates the future and selects the future's ignorance as a tool. Non-disclosure does not need a modern contract. In 1838, it can be a threat, a warning, a culture. Speak and you'll be sold. Speak and you'll be punished. Speak and you'll be ruined. The enslaved are coerced into silence by terror. The overseers are coerced into silence by employment. The neighbors are coerced into silence by mutual complicity. Silence is cheaper than accountability. And when silence is cheaper, silence spreads. This is why you can have a cover-up without a single theatrical villain. The man who orders lime tells himself it's sanitation. The man who pays cash tells himself he is being efficient. The man who writes "sent away" tells himself he is avoiding gossip. The minister who doesn't ask for names tells himself it isn't his place. Each person participates in a fraction of the erasure and therefore feels less responsible. That diffusion is the mechanism. It is how a system commits atrocity while allowing every participant to claim they were simply doing their job. By December 1838, the crisis window is over on paper. The crop cycle moves on. The record regains its calm tone. The totals stabilize. The language returns to routine. That calmness is not a sign of recovery. It is a sign that the machine successfully absorbed the loss without being forced to name it. And that is the real horror. The system doesn't collapse under what it did. It continues because continuation is its victory. Now jump forward. This is where the second discovery matters because it proves the cover-up is not confined to 1 year. The choice repeats. 30 years later, 50 years later, 80 years later, different century, same reflex. In this story, the jump is not a montage. It's an indictment of continuity. Imagine the property in 1868, after the war, after emancipation, when the language changes but the landscape remains, or in 1898, as new owners redraw boundaries and rebrand the same ground. Or in 1911, when a new drainage line is cut, or a road is widened, or a foundation is dug for a structure that will be described as historic later. The specifics vary, but the pattern is consistent. Someone disturbs the wrong soil and the ground answers back. In the later discovery, pick your decade, because the region offers multiple plausible windows. The evidence is never introduced as "we found enslaved graves." It is introduced as inconvenience, bones in a plow line, a cluster of depressions that don't match tree roots, artifacts with initials scratched into metal, buttons, nails, a fragment of wood that suggests a hurried box. If there is any marking at all, it is not a name carved into stone. It is the smallest, most desperate signature, an initial, a notch, a symbol, the kind of mark someone makes when they know the official world will refuse them a proper memorial. And then the choice repeats, because repeating is what institutions do when they are protecting themselves. The remains are reburied. The site is resealed. The report is minimized. The language shifts from 1838's euphemisms to the later era's euphemisms. Unidentified burials, possible cemetery, cultural materials, sensitive area. Same function, different vocabulary. The future is offered the same lie, that the absence of names is natural, that the lack of a list is accidental, that the ground is merely historical rather than criminal. One person, however, does what the institution cannot tolerate. They keep a private record. This is the fragile hinge the truth often depends on. A surveyor makes a sketch map and doesn't file it properly, meaning it survives outside the controlled archive. A contractor writes a note to himself, "Do not dig beyond the pine line." A local caretaker records a rumor as a fact. They buried them here in 38. A descendant hears it, repeats it, and refuses to forget it. These private records are small. They are not triumphant. They are not heroic proclamations. They are survival tactics for truth. Truth hiding in the same way the dead were forced to hide. And what is the institution's response to that private record when it surfaces? It is almost always the same response it had in 1838. Stop the spread. Control the narrative. Compartmentalize. If the private record can't be destroyed, it is discredited. If it can't be discredited, it is absorbed, reframed as local legend, unverified, sensitive. Sensitivity becomes the new silence. It sounds moral. It functions as suppression. This is the continuity I want you to recognize. 1838 isn't just a year on a ledger. It's a blueprint. The cover-up mechanism is not a one-time act. It is a habit passed down through paperwork and property transfer and institutional culture. The second discovery proves that the ground keeps interrupting the lie, and the lie keeps being reassembled anyway. And that's why the moral obligation doesn't expire. If you inherit land, you inherit what was done on it. If you inherit an archive, you inherit what it chose not to preserve. And if you inherit a silence, you have a choice. Repeat it or break it. Because the dead in nameless graves are not asking for poetry. They are asking for the simplest justice the living can provide: acknowledgement, account if possible, a reconstruction if necessary, and a refusal to let "we recommend resealing" become the final sentence of their story. Again, the truth rarely survives in the official archive on its own. It survives in what people hide from the official archive. A box kept under a bed, a folder tucked behind a row of respectable papers, a set of notes that never get cited because citing them would get the researcher cut off. That is the private archive, the human act of disobedience that history depends on. And in this story, the private archive is not a romantic flourish. It is the only reason 1838 still speaks at all. By the mid-20th century, let's say 1957, because that is the kind of year when renovations happen and institutions feel safe enough to reorganize their past. Records from old plantations and county offices are being consolidated, cataloged, cleaned. That word matters. Cleaned can mean preserved. It can also mean sanitized. A young historian, or a local researcher with family ties, requests access to estate packets and plantation daybooks. They are told yes, then told no, then told yes again under conditions. They are given what looks like a complete set: ledgers, correspondence, inventories. But completeness is a performance. The gaps are where the truth lives, and the private archive begins when the researcher notices that the gaps are not random. In 1957, the researcher finds a copied ledger excerpt that includes a line dated in 1838. Burials paid in cash. The copy is clean, almost too clean. No surrounding context, no names, no totals, a fragment. In a responsible world, that fragment would be treated like a siren. In an institution protecting itself, it is treated like an inconvenience. The researcher asks for the original daybook. They are told it is missing, or restricted, or in processing. Processing becomes a polite form of disappearance. The researcher asks for the burial register or the plantation medical log. They are told those records are not held or not extant. Extant is another word that hides agency. When multiple related records are not extant around the same summer, you are not seeing the randomness of time. You are seeing the afterlife of policy. The researcher does what serious investigators always do. They widen the net. They interview local families, especially black families who have lived near the same ground across generations, because the human archive is often more consistent than the paper one. In 1958, they sit at kitchen tables and hear the same kinds of sentences repeated with the weary certainty of inherited knowledge. They buried them out by the pine line. Don't dig back there. That was the sick time. The night they paid cash. The details differ, but the shape is stable. The researcher records names, not always full names, sometimes only first names carried down. Hagar, Cuffy, Rose. Not because they can prove each identity beyond doubt yet, but because naming is the first act of repair. The researcher sketches a map from memory. A low patch, a slight rise, a stand of trees that used to be thicker, a boundary that older people still call by an old name. By 1961, the researcher has enough to draft an unpublished manuscript chapter, not a sensational accusation, but a tight reconstruction. They lay out the receipts, the 1838 ledger fragment, the spike and replacement requests, the missing pages, the later rediscovery notes, the oral histories converging on the same location. The chapter's working title is something blunt, something that refuses euphemism: The Unnamed Burials, Summer 1838. And here is where the institutional immune system kicks in, because truth does not threaten only reputations. It threatens funding, access, donor comfort, civic mythology. The researcher submits the chapter to a journal or a local historical publication, or they present it to an archive board for permission to cite additional materials. And the response arrives in the most cowardly form it can take: procedural. In 1962, the researcher is told, politely, that the chapter is too speculative, that it could invite misunderstanding, that it lacks sufficient documentation, even though the lack of documentation is the very symptom being analyzed. This is the trick institutions use to protect themselves. They demand proof that their own secrecy makes impossible. They create a standard that only an honest archive could meet, then punish you for not meeting it. Then they offer a compromise that sounds reasonable: remove the section, and you can publish the rest. Keep your funding, keep your access, keep your career. Lose the dead. This is the hinge I want you to stare at without blinking. The researcher capitulates publicly, not because they suddenly doubt what they found, but because institutions are good at turning truth into a personal risk. And personal risk is how silence reproduces. The chapter is cut. The published work comes out in 1963. Useful, well-received, praised for being balanced. Balanced is another word for safe. The dead of 1838 remain unnamed, again, not because the evidence vanished, but because the gatekeepers demanded obedience. But the researcher does one thing that matters. They do not destroy the pages. They save them. In 1964, they type a clean copy and place it in a box with interview notes, hand-drawn maps, and the ledger fragment. They label it with something that looks harmless: field notes or draft chapters. The private archive is born exactly like that. Not dramatic, not grand, just stubborn. A refusal to fully comply. A decision to keep a record that the official world has told you it does not want. And this is why the truth in our century is always scattered. By 1978, the box moves with the researcher to a new home. By 1989, it sits in an attic. By 2006, an estate sale list includes old papers. By 2019, a descendant opens it and sees the same phrase that keeps returning like a curse: burials paid in cash. Alongside it, the map, the names, the dates, the researcher's warning written in the margin: site likely unmarked. Expect resistance. Resistance from whom? Not from the dead. From the living institutions built on their disappearance. Now we enter the modern technical report, because this is where contemporary language tries to perform innocence while repeating the same decision. In 2013, a survey is commissioned. Ground-penetrating radar, imaging, structural scan, call it what you want. Modern tools, modern professionalism. The report comes back with the kind of phrasing that sounds clinical but should terrify you if you know what it means. Subsurface anomalies consistent with human interments, or patterns suggestive of a burial ground, or high-density features aligned in rows. The report includes coordinates, it includes depth estimates, it includes confidence levels. In other words, the dead are no longer rumor, they are signal. And then the recommendation arrives, the sentence that proves the continuity of policy more clearly than any 1838 ledger ever could. In 2013, the report says, "We recommend against excavation." The justification is always framed as sensitivity, respect, risk management. Disturbance may be culturally inappropriate. Potential legal exposure. Community concerns. Some of these concerns can be real. But in this story, the pattern makes the motive legible. The same institution that once paid cash to avoid a trail now uses modern compliance language to achieve the same result. Do not bring the bodies into daylight. Do not force names into the record. Do not create a public count that will demand public reckoning. In 2014, a meeting is held. The minutes are vague. The decision is made quietly. The site is labeled in a way that discourages curiosity. Sensitive area. Fences go up, or landscaping is adjusted, or the development plan shifts a few meters. The ground is protected, yes, but protected from what? From desecration? Or from evidence? This is the question the report does not answer because the report is not allowed to ask it. Technical reports are tools. They can be used for truth. They can also be used for containment. And this is the moral lecture I refuse to soften. If your response to discovering the unmarked dead is to prevent further knowledge, you are not practicing respect. You are practicing control. Respect would mean consultation with descendants, a transparent accounting, a memorialization process that prioritizes naming and truth-telling where possible. Control means keep it quiet, keep it vague, keep it manageable. Control means the same thing it meant in 1838, just translated into modern bureaucracy. So here we are, with two archives again. The official archive now includes a glossy technical report that confirms anomalies. The human archive includes a box of forbidden pages that says what those anomalies likely are. The consequence of a crisis summer in 1838, when burials were paid in cash and names were treated as liabilities. And between them sits the institution, repeating the oldest decision in this story. Do not excavate. Do not name. Do not count. Do not let the dead interrupt the living. But the private archive exists, and that is the threat. Because it proves what the gatekeepers want you to believe is impossible, that evidence can survive them, That silence can be documented. That erasure leaves fingerprints. And once you see those fingerprints across 1838, 1962, and 2013, you can no longer pretend this is about lost history. It is about chosen forgetting, and chosen forgetting is not neutral. It is an act. It is a sin dressed as administration. Now we do the part institutions hate most. We separate what we can prove from what they forced us to infer, and we say out loud which unknowns exist only because someone chose to keep them unknown. This is not a courtroom, but the discipline is the same. Claims must match the record, and the record, fragmented, edited, scattered, still tells a coherent story if you stop treating the gaps as innocent. What we can prove begins with patterns, because patterns are what survive censorship. In the summer of 1838, late July through August into early September, the documentation changes behavior. Names churn, totals smooth over absences. Replacement requests spike. Sent away for care appears as a trapdoor phrase with no follow-up. That is not a single isolated oddity. It is a cluster of anomalies that tighten around a specific calendar window. And inside that window sits the line that refuses to be ordinary, an 1838 ledger entry recording multiple burials paid in cash. Burials, plural. Paid in cash as method, no names attached. Whatever you want to believe about intent, you cannot honestly call that normal. Normal burials generate routine paperwork. This line is a deviation, and deviations are where intent hides. We can also prove the institutional reflex that follows discovery. The later era repeats the same choice. A later disturbance, whether in the late 19th century or early 20th century, encounters remains or a suspected burial ground. The response is not a public accounting. The response is resealing, reburial, reclassification. The language evolves, but the outcome is stable. Keep it quiet, keep it contained, keep it uncounted. Then, in the modern era, 2013 in our reconstruction, the technical report identifies subsurface anomalies consistent with human interments. That is the modern version of the ground answering back. And the recommendation lands with the same weight as the 1838 cash payment. Do not disturb. We recommend against excavation. The continuity is not emotional, it is procedural. It is a repeated decision across time. Minimize the record, restrict the inquiry, protect the institution. Now the second bucket, what we can infer responsibly without pretending it is guesswork. When you have a crisis summer, 1838, marked by high absence, high replacement demand, and a burial expense line deliberately detached from names, the most plausible inference is not complicated. Multiple people died in a compressed window, and the institution handled the burials in a way designed to reduce traceability and reduce witnesses. That is what cash does in a burial context. It shrinks the paper trail. It bypasses normal accounts. It keeps the circle small. The inference is supported not by one sentence, but by the convergence of behaviors. The record's vagueness increases as the risk increases. That is not how honest documentation behaves. That is how risk management behaves. We can also infer that the burial site was selected strategically. Not strategically in the cinematic sense, no hooded meeting and candlelight, but in the mundane, cold sense. Choose a place that will not attract visitors. Choose a place that will not receive markers. Choose a place that will later be disturbed without ceremony. That is why so many unmarked burial grounds are rediscovered during development. The burial ground is not simply forgotten. It is placed where forgetting is likely. If the 2013 report identifies anomalies in an unused strip behind a boundary, that is exactly the kind of land an institution would use to bury people it did not want to name. We can infer something else too, that the confrontation letters in late 1838 were a pressure event and that admissions occurred only under leverage. That is how the system is wired. It does not confess because it feels remorse. It yields because it fears consequences. And when it yields minimally. It admits burials without admitting identities. It acknowledges loss without acknowledging responsibility. That's not accidental. That's legal instinct before the modern legal system. It's reputational instinct. It is the plantation economy protecting itself like a living organism. Now the third bucket, the unknowns that remain unknown because of choices made. This is where the moral indictment becomes unavoidable, because these unknowns are not mysteries in the romantic sense. They are manufactured. We do not know the full list of names because the institution recorded categories instead of identities. We do not know the exact count because totals were smoothed and burials were handled without attached rosters. We do not know precise causes of death because sent away for care replaced outcomes, and because medical logs, if they existed, were not preserved in the accessible archive. We do not know the exact location boundaries of the burial ground because maps were not drawn publicly and markers were not allowed. These gaps are not neutral. They are the residue of policy. And that brings us back to the cold open and forces it to change shape. When the modern crew hit bone and the shutdown came fast, no photos, no notes, reseal, what you witnessed was not only caution, it was inheritance. It was the old reflex, updated. The language now is sensitivity, stakeholders, risk, compliance. In 1838 it was cash, private, sent away. Different vocabulary, same impulse. Prevent the dead from becoming a public record. Prevent the dead from creating obligations. Because once the dead are counted, the living must answer. Here is the moral truth we can name without hesitation. Institutional reputation was protected at human cost. In 1838, that protection required erasing names in life and erasing names in death. In later decades, it required burying discovery reports, minimizing disturbances, treating remains as inconveniences rather than evidence of a crime of history. In 2013, it required a technical recommendation that sounded responsible while functioning as containment. And in our time, it requires the public to be tired, distracted, willing to accept "we recommend against excavation" as the end of the matter. But endings are choices too. So I'm going to end this the only honest way, not with closure, but with an obligation. The names that refuse to disappear are not always carved into stone. Sometimes they survive as first names in ration lists, as initials scratched into metal, as a warning repeated by grandparents who were never allowed to put grief on paper. Sometimes they survive as a hand-drawn map in a box labeled Field Notes, saved in 1964 by a researcher forced to cut the truth out of a published work in 1963. Sometimes they survive as a phrase that was meant to be a dead end, burials paid in cash. The institution wrote that line to close a transaction, but it did something else. It left a fingerprint. It proved intent. It proved that someone understood the act well enough to hide it. So here is the closing symbol. I won't let them take from us. Not a statue, not a museum plaque, not a sanitized lesson plan. A reconstructed list, partial, imperfect, but real, built from fragments. Hagar, Cuffy, Rose, names that the official archive treated as disposable and that the human archive carried anyway. You may never know their surnames because the system denied them that dignity. But you can know this. They lived. They labored. They vanished into a crisis summer in 1838 that someone tried to pay off in cash. And they were buried without markers in ground that later generations tried to call unused. If you're listening right now, you are part of the human archive. That's not poetic. That's responsibility. Comment where you're from, not because it helps an algorithm, because it builds a witness list. And if there is a patch of land in your county that everyone avoids digging, if there's a pine line, a low field, a back corner that old people won't name, tell me what they call it. Tell me what you've heard. Institutions rely on silence being lonely. The simplest way to break a policy is to refuse to be alone in it. Refuse to